Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Nick. For those of you who do not know me, I am a graduate assistant at the University of Georgia. Today we're going to do kind of an introduction to debate, but it's going to be like an advanced introduction to debate, which is maybe a little bit of an oxymoron and kind of a weird way to think about things. But so we're not going to talk about like what are the speech times or really basic things like that, but instead we're going to start with kind of how you should think about debate, like what you kind of, your worldview, I guess, your paradigm is the word that I like to use for when you go into a particular debate, kind of the job on the affirmative versus the negative, offense and defense. And then we're going to go into some general argumentation theory kinds of things. So these will be, so we're going to talk about like the parts of an argument. We're going to talk about kinds of reasoning, what an enthymeme is, and then logical fallacies. All of these things are important to think about in terms of debate because we oftentimes forget them, I think. But they are also really useful for knowing in terms of your real everyday lives. And so I hope that this is helpful, not just for debate, but for everything as you're kind of going about. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll start with the debate-oriented particular things. Oh, actually, sorry, side note. I will stop in between kind of the sections of this lecture and give you all a chance to ask questions. If you have a question, please just click the raise hand button. Or I guess you can say it out loud. Raise hand will be a little bit more organized, so I prefer that you use that. But then I'll also obviously have time at the end for other questions as we're going along. So to begin on the debate kind of side of thing, the word that I like to use to describe for thinking about debate is this word called paradigm, just P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M. A paradigm is really a way of thinking about how to think about things. So it's kind of the things that you assume when you go into a situation. It's what you kind of expect conversations to result in, maybe what the kind of orientation towards goals are, things like that. So it's really about how you think about things and what you should be doing. So I start with this because it's important to remember that within a particular debate, your job is to persuade your judge, right? So the way you should be thinking about it, really your paradigm should be is how do I go about persuading this particular judge? Because your goal in each individual debate is to win that debate, right? Your goal is to win that debate. And persuasion is everywhere, and different people are persuaded by so many different things in so many different ways that it sometimes is kind of difficult to think about, how should I go about persuading this person? Luckily, in terms of policy debate in particular, we have kind of a normal way or a normalized, I guess, way of thinking about judging and thinking about debating itself. And so there are kind of some guidelines that you can follow, but this isn't always inevitably going to be true. Especially if you've got people who are less familiar with kind of the paradigm of debate writ large. But all that being said, so in a debate, there are obviously two sides. We've got the affirmative and the negative. The affirmative's job when they're debating is twofold. It's number one, describe a problem with the world. Number two, describe a solution to that problem. Okay, so number one, what's the problem in the world? Number two, what's the solution to it? Every single affirmative, no matter what, whether they are topical, whether they are critical, whether they are non-topical but about the topic, whether they read a plan but have nothing to do with the topic at all, every single affirmative will fall into that category. They will do two things. They will describe a problem with the world, and then they will describe a solution to that problem, right? The affirmative has to do those two things, and if the affirmative does not do those two things, they will not win the debate. Then the negative's job is twofold, which is number one, prove that the asked solution is bad, i.e. offense. Number two, prove that the asked problem doesn't matter, i.e. have some kind of defense against the affirmative's piece of offense. Right, so the negative's job is to prove that the asked solution is bad and to prove that their problem doesn't matter. If the negative doesn't have both of these things, the negative doesn't win. And there's like obviously a whole bunch of different ways that the negative goes about doing these things, right? The asked solution is bad, oftentimes may be a disadvantage, it may be a critique. the problem doesn't matter category, either oftentimes as a counter plan or case defense. But there are obviously a bunch of different combinations that could possibly go into those things. But it's important to think about those pieces, because if you don't remember, for example, as the negative that you have to prove the F solution is a bad idea, you're not going to win the debate. So the way we go about thinking about this is within offense and defense. So defense is just this kind of, no, you are wrong, right? So a defensive argument might be something like, terrorism does not cause nuclear war, right? Or that drug cartels have diversified their supply, and so the affirmative that we have in the practice, the affirmative that we have in the demo packet does not solve, right? Those are kind of defensive arguments. Offense is, no, you are bad, right? The difference between being that defense is no, you're wrong, offense is no, you are bad, right? So you are actively doing something that is negatively affecting how the world works. So the disadvantage is a great example of offense here. Or the abolition critique might be a good example of offense here. You need to have both in order to win, right? You cannot get away with just having defense. You cannot get away with just having offense. And so it's important to have both of these things. And the reason why you need to have both of these things is because in debate, we always think about stuff in terms of what we call risk. We think about things in terms of risk. Risk is just the chance of something happening, right? We never think that something is absolute in debate, right? Nothing is absolutely 100% sure, but rather it's just probable, right? So it's likely or it's unlikely. Sometimes people like literally will quantify this and be like, there's an 85% chance. That is kind of a weird way of thinking about things. So people do that sometimes, right? But you should, it's important that you think about that, because that's what your judges are doing, right? None of your judges are ever like, this is a 100% done deal. It's always, there's a chance of something happening. And that goes in terms of both offense and defense, right? And so the way that a judge really decides the debate, generally speaking, is the chance of the offense on one side is more persuasive, more relevant, more probable, something like that, than the chance of offense on the other side. And that gets determined based on both one team's offense and the other team's defense. Okay, does that kind of brief overview of how you think about debate make sense? Does anyone have questions for what we've said so far before we get into kind of argumentation stuff? I do that generally pretty briefly because most of that should be a review for you. And then the rest of the things we're going to talk about should be mostly new information. But oh, yes. Sorry, I scrolled past. No, wait, that's not a K Baylor. Is that a question or was that just, okay. Sorry, Zoom is weird. Okay, so we're going to keep going. The rest of the things we're going to talk about here are, like I said before, kind of general argumentation theory kinds of things. These matter a lot for policy debate, but like I said before, also useful to know just in your general day-to-day life. Really helpful in terms of classes, papers that you'll write, arguing with parents, etc. Also, this is a huge part of the lecture that I give my college students. So if you understand what I'm about to talk about, then you are at least as smart as people who are 5 to 8 years older than you. So congrats, and you are going to do great when you take like general introduction to argumentation classes. So first thing, what's an argument? In debate, we oftentimes think of an argument as claim plus warrant, right? In debate, we think of it as claim and warrant. Whereas a claim is the statement that we think is true, and then the warrant is the because. In actual argumentation theory, there's 3 parts actually. So we've got the claim, we've got the warrant, and then we've got reasoning. We've got reasoning. And reasoning is a little bit weird to think about because it is what connects the claim and the warrant together. So it's how they make sense together. So an example of if we don't worry about reasoning, if we just think that an argument is a claim and a warrant, then a legitimate argument would be something like, if I have this pen and I drop it, it will fall because the sky is blue, right? That's a claim. If I drop this pen, it will fall. And it's a warrant because the sky is blue, right? But that doesn't have any reasoning to it because that's just not how it works, right? Pens don't fall because the sky is blue. Pens fall because gravity. So when we don't have reasoning, we can get away with making claims and connecting them to warrants in really illogical ways, right? So reasoning is just that extra step of saying, why and how does my warrant actually prove that this claim is true? And I really think it is a problem that we in debate don't think about reasoning very often, because I really think that it's the easiest way that there's a disconnect between what debaters are saying and what judges understand. It's like if you've ever been in a debate where, you know, you've got an argument and it's just dropped, right? It's just, you've got your claim, you've got your warrant, it's just not answered by the other side. But then the judge is still just like, yeah, but I don't know, that didn't really make sense to me. You know, I didn't think you really explained it very well, and so I couldn't vote on it, something like that. That's really their way of saying that you're missing reasoning, right? Whether they know that that's the language that they're trying to use or not, really what they're saying is you're missing reasoning. And so I can give another example in a debate that I watched at the TOC this past year. I watched a team read what is basically a death K, and they said that affect or emotion has to be a prior question to literal death because it is something that we all experience, right? And so claim, affect, emotion, prior question, warrant, it's something we all experience. Therefore, it comes first. But at the end of the day, was just like, yeah, but I don't know why that actually means it comes first, right? Like, I thought that was missing reasoning there. I thought it was missing, you know, how do I connect that claim and that warrant together in such a way that I could understand what it meant, or why that then means that it comes first in my decision calculus or something like that. And so, you know, at the end of the day, I looked at them and I was like, yeah, like, you're right, this is not answered, but I don't really know what I do with this, right? I don't really think you're explaining it very well. I don't really think you have reasoning. I, you know, was just like, I can't vote on this. And so, you know, things like that happen all the time. I assume that all of you can think of at least one or two examples of this occurring to you where you had something that was conceded, but the judge did not vote on it, likely because you're missing reasoning. And so incorporating that into your arguments, I think, is really important and a good thing to think about. So does reasoning make sense to everyone? Do we have any questions about that? I do not see any hand raised. Okay. To get a little bit more into reasoning, there are several hands now. Okay, Joshua.
Wouldn't reasoning be kind of like your link?
In a way, reasoning is like the link between the claim and the warrant. So it's not the link in terms of like you have a link to a DA, but it is a link between a claim and a warrant. An example of an argument with all three parts. So let's say okay, so another debate I watched at the TOC last year, the affirmative said we should stop selling ballistic missile defense to Japan. The negative read just like Russia is evil, disadvantage. And the negative said that if we stop selling BMDs to Japan, then it, you know, ruins our deterrence posture towards Russia, et cetera. You know, just that basic DA. So claim, if we stop selling BMDs to Japan, then we will no longer be able to effectively deter Russia. Warrant is that BMDs are important for deterring Russia, right? So like it shows that we have an offensive posture against them, and I don't know, it makes Russia feel like they're constrained by us, whatever reason you can think of. Reasoning of that was, well, because Russia is a country that we just cannot trust, because they are offensive realists and they are actively revisionist and trying to take over the world, if we give them anything at all, they will use that as an opportunity to then take over the world. So it's just like if you give a mouse a cookie kind of thing, right? And so the idea was, if we then give up BMD, Russia will use that as their opportunity to be revisionist and take over I don't remember where they said Russia would take over, but it was, Russia, spear, adventurism, that kind of stuff, right? And so there was reasoning behind that, i.e. the way that Russia acts means that if we stop deterring them in any sense, then they will try and take over the world. Does that make sense? Does that answer a good explanation? The claim is important in the context of the debate. Kind of. It's not so much in the context of the debate as it is in the context of making your warrant prove that your claim is correct. So it can be in the context of the debate, but it can also be in the context of just your particular argument. Right, so if the easiest way to explain it is what it is, to give an example of what it does not, or give an example of an argument that does not have it, right? So again, that pen dropping thing, if I drop this pen, it will fall to the ground because the sky is blue, is like a claim and a warrant, but it has no reasoning because there's nothing that connects the fact that the sky is blue to a pen falling. It does apply to both the af and the neg, yes. How would you connect that argument with reasoning? Well, the pen falling because sky is blue, you can't connect with reasoning because there's no reasoning. There's no reason that the sky being blue makes a pen fall. But the real argument would be if I drop this pen, it will fall because gravity makes it fall. And then the reasoning being that gravity is a constant at, I don't remember what the exact amount is, like whatever meters per second squared, that exists because of how large this planet is, that it draws things into its orbit, right? So you would explain what gravity is. Don't you use reasoning? Do you use reasoning more in the rebuttals? Generally, yes, because in the later speeches, I should say. So the 2NC on usually will have a bit more reasoning, mostly because the 1AC, 1NC, and 2AC are all just introducing arguments, as opposed to really, really explaining and unpacking them. So yes, you are correct that reasoning tends to be used a lot more often in rebuttals than it does in earlier speeches. But I'm going to also throw the 2NC in there because the 2NC should have a lot of reasoning as well. Other questions? Okay, so there are two kinds of reasoning. The first one is called deductive reasoning, and the second one is inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is formal logic. So it is logic that is absolutely completely true. So when I say that, I mean that the logic, the things that are connecting those things have to be 100% correct. I don't mean necessarily that the argument itself is absolutely correct, but I do mean that the connections between the arguments are correct. And so that'll make more sense when I give you some examples. But the first one is what's called a categorical syllogism, which is based on categories. So an easy example would be, all debate coaches are amazing. Nick is a debate coach, therefore Nick is amazing. Right? So like I said, you can disagree with those premises, right? You can disagree with the idea that all debate coaches are amazing. You can disagree with the idea that I am a debate coach, which would be weird. I'm definitely a debate coach. But you could disagree with that, right? But the logic absolutely for sure follows from it, right? If both of those premises are true, then the conclusion definitely is for sure true, right? If all debate coaches are amazing and I am a debate coach, therefore I must be amazing. And so we're going to talk about three kinds of deductive reasoning. That's the first one, which is called a categorical syllogism, which is based on categories. That's how you can think about it, categorical categories, right? So the idea is we've got a category of things, we've got one thing within that category, therefore that thing in that category has to have the same kind of characteristics as the category itself, right? So all debate coaches are amazing. Nick is a debate coach, therefore Nick is amazing. That's a categorical syllogism. The second kind of deductive reasoning is a disjunctive syllogism, which is an either-or scenario. So you could say either I am awake and in lab, or I'm sleeping. I am awake and in lab, therefore I am not sleeping, right? So either it has to be A or B. It's A, therefore not B, or A or B, not B, therefore A. So either I'm awake and in lab, or I'm sleeping, right? So either A, I'm awake, I'm in lab, or B, I'm sleeping. Has to be one of those two things. I am awake and in lab, A, therefore I am not sleeping, not B. That is a disjunctive syllogism. Sorry, that's a weird word to write, so I will write it out in the chat for you. Disjunctive syllogism. And the third kind of deductive reasoning is a conditional syllogism, which is an if-then scenario, right? If something happens, then this other thing will happen. Therefore, this thing happens. So if I skip lab to sleep, then I will do poorly at debate, right? So if this thing happens, then this other thing is going to happen. If I skip lab to sleep, then I will do poorly at debate. I skipped lab to sleep today, therefore I will do poorly at debate. Right? So if A, then B, A, therefore B. So if I skip lab to sleep, I will do poorly at debate. I skip lab today, therefore I will do poorly at debate. Again, the idea of deductive reasoning, each of these three examples that are three types of deductive reasoning that I've given you all here, which is, again, categorical syllogism, which is based on categories, disjunctive syllogism, which is kind of the either or scenario, and then conditional syllogism, which is an if-then kind of scenario. The idea of these things are that it's about the logic being absolutely 100% true, right? So you can disagree with the statements, the things that are said, or the argument itself, but you cannot disagree with the connections between them. Does that make sense? Does someone need me to repeat any of those terms? Because I know that they're complicated and weird. The last example of deductive reasoning is called a conditional syllogism. I will write that in the chat for you as well. Conditional syllogism. The first one is a categorical syllogism, which I will also write. For disjunctive syllogism, can we get another example? Yes. Disjunctive, another example might be either I am paying attention and either I am paying attention to this lecture or I am not paying attention to this lecture. I am paying attention to this lecture, therefore I am not paying attention to the lecture. So although the opposition may not agree, the points cannot be taken down. The logic connecting them cannot be taken down, but the argument itself can be taken down, right? So the easiest example of that categorical syllogism that I said before, all debate coaches are amazing, Nick is a debate coach, therefore Nick is amazing. You could disagree with those premises, right? You could say, no, not all debate coaches are amazing. Some of them are really terrible and I hate them and they're mean. Right, so you can disagree with the premise, with the thing being said, with the argument itself. You just can't disagree with the logic, right? You like if the first two things are true, then the third thing also has to be true. Is a double bind an example of a disjunctive syllogism? A double bind an example of a disjunctive syllogism? Kind of, actually. So yeah, either the double bind tends to be either this thing is true or this other thing is true, and either way, you know, you lose. So yeah, I think so. I'd have to think about that a little bit more to be absolutely confident, but I think yes, a double bind is an example of disjunctive syllogism. Is reasoning the same as logic? Depends on what you think of as logic. So I'm just going to say yes for now. It's, yeah, we're just going to go with yes for now. So is everyone good on deductive reasoning? The other type of reasoning that we use in an argument Now remember, reasoning is the third part of an argument that we oftentimes forget, but is really important to remember. The other type of reasoning is what's called inductive reasoning. So the first one was deductive, this one is inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is reasoning based on probabilities rather than absolutes. So it really is kind of the opposite of deductive reasoning, right? If deductive reasoning is like, we absolutely know that this logic works, inductive reasoning is when you reason where you don't know that that logic is absolutely true. And it's really important to think about because it's really what you're doing in debate. Like I said at the beginning, we think about things in terms of risk, in terms of probability or likelihood of things occurring. It's very, very rare that we will use deductive reasoning in debate. And so because we're always talking about probabilities, right? We're talking about things that could occur as opposed to we know for sure it is going to occur. So an example of inductive reasoning might be, if I know that 85% of students at this lecture loves online debate camp, then if I ask any one of you if you love online debate camp, I can likely assume before you answer that you're going to say yes. In fact, I can assume with an 85% probability that you will say yes, right? I cannot be certain. I don't know for sure, right? Because there's 15% of you who don't know or who do not love online debate camp. But I can be like pretty reasonably sure that you're likely going to say yes. Right, so inductive reasoning is really just when we reason based on probabilities. And like I said before, it's really what we're doing in debate all the time. And honestly, for the most part, it's what you're doing in your everyday life all the time, because really we're always dealing with probabilities, right? It's very rare that we know for sure that things are absolutely true. And that kind of skepticism, I think, is really important for debate. Okay, we all good on reasoning? Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is what's called an enthymeme, which is also a weird word, so I'm just going to write that in the chat. Enthymeme. So I assume that you're all familiar with the second half of this word, which is meme, right? Because you're all capable of using the internet. And memes really do devolve from enthymemes, so it's like kind of a pretty similar thing. But an enthymeme is an argument that is purposefully missing a premise or a conclusion so that the audience can fill it in. So I will repeat that. An enthymeme is an argument that purposefully misses a premise or a conclusion so that the audience then fills it in. Right? And memes actually do work like this, right? So if you see like, especially all of the political oriented memes that are like, okay, my current new favorite meme is the one where it's like a Doge, and one of them is like a weak little Doge, and then the other one is like the big, strong, super muscular Doge, and it's like X people today versus X people 100 years ago kind of thing, and it's like the people today are, I don't know, like really weak and capable of doing something, but then the people 100 years ago were like really strong, muscular, whatever, can do things. Like that's an argument, right? It's making an argument about how people today work versus people today 100 years ago kind of thing. But it's missing premises, right? It's not explicitly saying, people today are very weak versus people yesterday were really strong or whatever, something like that, right? It's missing that premise, or it's missing that conclusion for you as the audience member to then fill it in, right? So enthymemes are really incomplete arguments, but they are incomplete arguments in a way that the audience is supposed to connect with them and then be able to fill in the blanks. So you all use these constantly, whether you know it or not. The two most common examples in debate are nuclear war and death, right? So oftentimes you'll see that a 1AC or a 1NC DA will just end in, X thing causes nuclear war, right? And we all stop there. And then later on in the debate, we say that X thing causes extinction, right? So we have enthematically said that nuclear war causes extinction, right? People don't really read cards that are like nuclear war causes extinction anymore because it's just kind of assumed, right? Your audience fills in that blank for you in a debate, right? Your audience can look at you and say, yeah, I mean, if a global nuclear war were to occur, it would cause extinction, or it would functionally cause extinction, right? Even if we don't have a card that says, reads like a nuclear winter theory study or something like that, right? But that's your audience filling in that blank for you, right? Nuclear war causes extinction, or death is bad, right? No one, pretty much no one, in the 1AC or the 1MC will read a card that says it's really, really bad if people die, because we all assume that, right? We all assume that death is a bad thing, right? So those things get filled in enthematically, is what we'd say. And I think it's important to think about this concept for two reasons. One, like I said before, we do it all the time, especially in debate. And two, I think we oftentimes accidentally do it when we think that we are filling in all of the pieces, which could be bad because you have to rely on your audience to fill in that piece for you in your direction, right? So if you need your audience member to decide that nuclear war does cause extinction, to like fill in that blank for you, you are relying on them to do that, right? We can, for the most part, trust our judges to do that, but there are examples where that's not always true. Like, to kind of throw back to that Doge meme example that I talked about, like there's a way to look at that meme of, people now really weak, people 100 years ago really strong. There's a way to look at that meme and be like, oh, this is a really conservative meme, right? This is a really pro-Trump meme. But there's also a way to look at that meme and be like, oh no, this is actually a really, really liberal meme, or a really, really leftist meme, right? Depending on what they're talking about, or how you understand what it is that they're talking about. So the point of that example really is to say that there's always room for someone to misinterpret an entity. And so we want to generally in debate try our best to not use enthymemes and instead fill in the blank with these complete arguments, or to make our arguments as complete as they can be. Again, it's impossible to ever completely get rid of any enthymemes. Like, I'm really not saying that you need to radically rewrite your 1ACs. So you read a card that says nuclear war causes extinction and another card that says death is bad. Like, you probably don't need to do that, but there are occasions where you do. Like, if you're debating a team that says death is good or death doesn't matter, then you should put in a card that says death is bad on the 1AC. But for the most part, you don't need to do that. But it's important to know what an enthymeme is, so you know when you are expecting your judge to fill in the blank and when you are asking your judge, or when you need to ask yourself to not ask your judge to do that. Does that idea make sense? Does everyone understand what an enthymeme is? Okay, see no hands. We're going with it. Okay, and then the last section that I want to talk about, which is probably going to be the longest section here, is about logical fallacies. Logical fallacies, for those of you who are not familiar with this term, are errors in logic that seem like they make sense, but they don't actually make sense. And there are very, very fine distinctions between what is a logical fallacy and oftentimes what is not a logical fallacy, because the point of a logical fallacy is that it looks like it should be a real argument, but it's not actually a real argument. So I'll give you all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pretty common examples. And you'll notice pretty quickly that these are, again, very close to actual arguments. And I'll try to draw the distinction between the fallacy and the actual argument here. The first one is what's called an ad hominem. An ad hominem, which I will write that word in the chat because all of these, actually most of these words are kind of like weird Latin things. So I'll write most of them in the chat for you. But an ad hominem is when you attack someone's character rather than their argument. So if you respond to an argument by saying, yeah, but you're stupid, that's an ad hominem, right? I think I like to start here because it's pretty much the most basic example. I assume most of you have heard of an ad hom in some capacity, or at least recognize that that's probably not a legitimate argument. Like, if you're debating a team who reads the politics DA, if you stand up in the 2AC and say, number one, you're stupid, it's not an argument. obviously. Number 2 is what's called an ad verecundium. Ad verecundium. It's a weird word. Again, this is what's called an appeal to authority. So if you have, we will get there in one sec, David, because that's actually the concern with ad verecundium. Ad verecundium is appeal to an authority. If you have siblings, you will know this very, very well. When I was a kid, my sister and I would get into fights all the time, and it would always devolve into, but mom said so, or but dad said so, or something like that. Like that would be an example of an ad verecundium, right? Which is just appeal to authority. This person who's an authority said so, therefore it must absolutely be true. There is a very, very fine line between this and a real argument, because author qualifications do matter, right? Like we should be reading cards that are from experts, but you got to think about why those cards come from experts. Give me 1 second. I will answer that question about racist, sexist, etc. in a moment. And so, like I said, there's a very fine line between appeal to authority and then the argument of like we should be using cards from authors. But you got to think about why they're qualified, how they're qualified, and then what that means for the argument, right? So the ad verecundium logical fallacy really just stops at this authority said so, therefore it must be true, right? The way you make that not be a fallacy is to say, this person is qualified. We know they're qualified because they've done a bunch of research on this thing. And because they've done a bunch of research on this thing, you know, they've thought about a whole bunch of different possible positions. They've read hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and talked to people, etc. And, you know, they have this argument, and it is a complete argument because, you know, it has the claim, warrant, and reasoning. Therefore, it's not just therefore we can trust it, but it is therefore we can trust it in comparison to this other argument from this less qualified source, right? So that in comparison piece matters because again, it's about risk, right? Ad verecundium says this person is right, or this person said it, therefore it is correct. 100%, we are absolutely true. We're absolutely sure. The not logical fallacy version of this is we can likely trust what they're saying, right? Remember, we've got that healthy dose of skepticism in debate. We've got this idea of thinking about things in terms of risk rather than absolutes. The 2 questions in the chat, sorry, David, I realize now that your question was actually about ad hominem, not ad verecundium. If someone says the card's author is biased or stupid, it's not, so saying that someone is stupid is not an argument. Saying that someone is biased is potentially an argument, depending on what that bias is and why it matters. So again, thinking about things in terms of claim, warrant, reasoning is really, really important here. So if you're reading a Trump bad elections disadvantage and your impact piece of evidence is from someone who is on the, I don't know, like campaign to make sure Trump gets out of office.com or whatever, I don't know, that's just some string of words I just made up, then like, yes, you can probably make an argument that's like, that person has bias, you know, that they are literally paid to write these things, so maybe they're doing less rigorous research, so maybe we can't trust what they're saying quite as strongly. But again, it's not to say like, absolutely you have to throw that card out ever, right? But it's more just like we have to think about how they have come to those conclusions and how we've gotten there. What if you're saying that they are racist, sexist, etc.? That is a big whole conversation, which I think deserves a lot more depth than I can give it an answer here, but I'll give you kind of a TLDR answer, is that it depends on what you are saying is racist, sexist, etc. If your position is that you might say that a card should be thrown out because the author has racist, sexist, ableist tendencies in their writing, in which case you could make the argument that that has infiltrated and kind of seeped into their argument, and thus we should not accept anything, or we should not really understand anything that they have written as worth discussing because it comes from a position of comes from a problematic position. That is a legitimate argument to make. If you are saying that, yeah, everything else I don't want to say would require dramatically more explanation than we really got time for. So let's go with that. The idea of logical fallacies is not to suggest that you cannot, nor that you should not call out people for ableist, sexist, racist language or authors, etc. But it is to suggest that we have to kind of think more critically about the evidence that we are reading and the evidence that other teams are reading, and how we are going about answering those things, right? So calling a piece of evidence or a word that someone uses racist is not the equivalent of calling it stupid. And then, are you able to explain the fine line between ad verecundium and an actual argument again? Yes. So ad verecundium, the appeal to authority logical fallacy, says this person says it is true, therefore, full stop, it absolutely is true. Right, so it's to say, we know for sure that it is absolutely 100% correct, versus a more legitimate argument would say, we can likely trust what this person is saying, right? So you can think about it really in terms of risk, right? Ad verecundium says, this person says it's true, therefore it must 100% be true, right? So we're not thinking about things in terms of risk, we're just thinking about things in terms of absolutes. Versus the way you should really be thinking about it is in terms of risks, right? We can likely trust what this person has said is true because as an expert in this field, they've spent a lot of time doing research, talking to people, reading books, et cetera, et cetera. Is attacking whether the opposing team is unreliable because their arguments contradict ad hominem. I think what this question is asking is whether making the argument that the other team is saying an ad hominem, is that a legitimate argument to make in debate? To which I'd say that I think it is reasonable to, if the other team is deploying ad hominems and just kind of calling you names instead of making arguments against you, I think it is reasonable to say, hey, that's not an argument, and suggest that they advance arguments instead. Yeah, I think that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know. I'm happy to try and answer it differently. Okay, so those are the first two logical fallacies. Again, ad hominem, which is attacking someone's character rather than their argument, i.e. you're stupid. And then ad verecundium, which is an appeal to authority to kind of just stop the argument. So, but mom said so. The third logical fallacy, which is by and far the most common one in debate, is what's called a slippery slope, which is that this idea that it's the belief that a bunch of unavoidable things will happen if this first thing does. So a really common slippery slope in public discourse a couple years ago when people were talking about legalizing gay marriage was that if we allow gay marriage, then next we're just going to allow people to marry their pets, right? Or we're going to allow polygamy, and we can't ever possibly allow polygamy, right? So if one thing happens, then this other thing happens, and it's unavoidable, and it's terrible, and everything is just going to go to hell and things are going to suck, right? We use this all the time in debate. The kind of extreme debate example that I always give is just terrorism will cause extinction, right? As soon as a nuclear bomb goes off, everyone dies, right? Like that is a slippery slope fallacy, because the idea that one bomb suddenly goes off and every single person in the entire world dies just there's no logic connecting those two statements there. That being said, we can and should make our arguments more complex, have more detail, and walk people through what those scenarios look like to avoid the slippery slope fallacy. So my point here is not to say don't read a terrorism impact ever, because you can legitimately say that terrorism can cause extinction, but you need to explain how it works. So the better way of explaining that argument would be something like, if terrorists then steal nuclear fissile materials from unprotected weapons in Pakistan or Iran, They can then find blueprints online and fashion it into a bomb. They can then sneak that bomb into the United States and detonate it in New York City, make it look like that bomb came from Russia, which thereby means that the US thinks that Russia detonated a nuclear weapon in New York City, which then means that we retaliate because we think they first striked on us. We retaliate likely with a nuclear weapon because of how our deterrence posture or how our nuclear weapons postures operate, which then means Russia responds with nuclear weapons. The US and Russia collectively have the most amount of nuclear weapons of any countries in the world, which means that causes the nuclear World War III. And nuclear winter theory means that when that quantity of bombs goes off, then actually extinction does occur, right? That scenario may still be a little bit absurd, but it is a lot more logical, right? We are explaining how the steps of this actually works instead of just saying terrorism causes extinction as soon as a bomb goes off, boom. Right, and that's really the difference there, is that the slippery slope is kind of the less detailed, the kind of more absurd, honestly, example of a complete argument. Sorry, there was a question before that one. How does slippery slope play into the idea of conjunctive probability? Dylan, would you explain what you're thinking with this? Because I'm not really sure what your connection you're drawing here is.
Yeah, I was just thinking so you had that whole link story that was super long. Let's say the probability is 60%, obviously, of each individual occurrence happening. Then the probability of the whole thing happening is probably going to be very, very low, considering that you have that many links and whatever. So this slippery slope kind of mean that the probability is just very low due to it's just so many low probability links.
Think of slippery slope more as not so much just that there's a low probability internal link, but rather that there's just no explanation of an internal link. Sorry, cars just drove by my house. I live off a pretty major road. Did everyone catch that? The slippery slope is more we just kind of assume that all of these terrible things will happen without any explanation whatsoever. Versus a low probability, terrorism causing extinction in reality is a pretty low probability impact, but it is theoretically possible once walking through all of those steps, right? It is logical, potentially, to make that argument. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. If we have evidence, wait, is that the next question? Sorry.
I think
if we have evidence.
Your previous answer already answered my question.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah. So ad hominem, ad verecundium, and slippery slope are all ideological fallacies. They are logical fallacies, is what we say. I'll write that in the chat. Logical fallacies. And I don't want to get into a whole big explanation of what ideology is, but ideology is a little bit closer to a paradigm, a way that we view the world, as opposed to logical fallacies is just problems within our logic. So those are three examples. I'll talk about two more real quick. The next one is a straw person. This used to be understood as straw man, but I think it would be it's a lot better for us to say straw person instead, because we should pay attention to gendered language. Obviously non-dudes can make arguments and also can make logical fallacies sometimes. So you should use or think about the term straw person rather than the term straw man. But if you're reading something and someone calls something straw man, that's the same thing as straw person. But a straw person fallacy is where you attack a false or a weaker instance of someone else's argument. So it's where you attack a false or a weaker instance of someone else's argument. And it's where, so you see these, if you ever turn on the news and just watch one of those nonsense, terrible segments where someone from the political left is debating someone from the political right, not strong, then you'll see people do straw person arguments all the time. But I was thinking about an example earlier today, and the one that kept popping up in my mind is in framework debates. When you know, the AF sometimes will advance the argument as a counter interpretation, which is just your interpretation plus our AF, which is, you know, has some problems in and of itself, but, you know, the AF may forward that argument, counter interpretation, your interpretation of how the topic works, plus allow our AF to be topical. And then the neg responds to that by saying that inter means that anything gets to be topical. Right? It's like those are not the same thing. To say counter interpretation, your inter plus our AF is not the equivalent of every single thing ever gets to be topical. Right? That would be a straw person understanding of what that other team's argument is. Right? Because what the AF's interpretation actually is that the negatives interpretation plus the AF's AF as well. Right? Versus, you know, saying everything gets to be topical. There's a difference. Like that AF interp is probably still bad for debate because it's arbitrary, and it could devolve into a world where any affirmative team gets to say, but we get to be topical even if these other teams don't get to be topical. But that is not the equivalent of saying that all AFs are topical, right? So side note, when you're in a framework debate, if you're negative and you answer counter interp, your interp plus our AF by saying that means everything gets to be topical, it's not quite correct, but it's a caricature of what that argument is, right? What the argument really is saying is your interpretation, you know, of topical policy action plus we get to read our affirmative as well. And so the point of talking about the straw person fallacy, particularly in terms of debate, is that it really does change how you answer things. And it does mean that you need to really pay attention to the nuances of what the other team is saying, because if you are answering a faulty version of what the other team is saying, kind of a weaker version of it, then you're not actually answering their argument, right? You're answering a fake version of that argument. And the problem then becomes that they then get to stand up and re-explain what they're saying, get to say, you know, actually, by the way, the other team didn't actually answer what we're saying. And then the judge afterwards will say, oh yeah, but you know, they really explained this to me. It makes a lot of sense. I don't think you really actually answered it, so I voted for them. And so the real way to avoid, honestly, the real way to avoid any logical fallacy is to listen to what the other team is saying and flow and, you know, think about what they're saying and think about nuances and try and have nuances in your arguments as well as their arguments. But that's particularly true with the straw person fallacy, because when you attack or answer a caricature, a faulty version of what the other team is saying, it's a lot easier for the other team to stand up and say, no, you didn't actually answer our argument. It was this, blah, blah, blah. Give a specific, give a specific example of a straw person fallacy. Is that what you're asking, David?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So let me try and think of, people right now are having a lot of debates about removing monuments in this country in particular, monuments that commemorate Confederate leaders. You know, people who are arguing in favor of the removal of these monuments oftentimes say that we should not keep them up because it, you know, it commemorates them, right? It celebrates them. It celebrates the things that they've done, and that might contribute to kind of an ongoing legacy of slavery or racism, various different forms of violences. People who defend these statues oftentimes respond to that by saying, by accusing the people who want to take down the statues of saying that they want to revise all of history. Right, so people who say get rid of the statues are like, hey, don't keep those up because they, I don't know, say that like the Confederates were great and the Confederates were not great, like slavery was bad, right? And then people who respond to that are like, but you're just revising history. Like you can't revise history. We need to know things that like happened in the past, right? Which is like not actually what the people saying take down the monuments are saying, right? No one who takes down the monuments are like, we should forget that the Civil War happened. But they often get characterized as saying that by people who say keep the monuments up, right? That would be a straw person fallacy committed by the people who say keep the monuments up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Okay, last logical fallacy I want to talk about, and then we'll leave the last, I don't know, however much time we have for any other questions, is what's called a hasty generalization. Hasty generalizations, or hasty Gs if you want to be cool and shorten it. But a hasty generalization is when you draw an assumption based on a very limited amount of data. This, by the way, is really how all discrimination happens in reality, side note, but hasty generalization. So an example of a hasty generalization might be, I tasted ice cream that was pineapple flavor once, therefore I can conclude that all ice cream tastes like pineapples. Right, that's just like, doesn't make any sense. Like I tasted ice cream one time, it was one kind of ice cream that happened to be pineapple flavor. I cannot logically conclude that all ice cream tastes like pineapple. But hasty generalizations do happen sometimes, right? And you may have them, you may accidentally commit them when you go into a debate, or in a debate in a couple different ways. So like you might go into a debate assuming you know what the other team is going to say. And so you might write your affirmative or your negative strategy around something that doesn't actually happen, right? And then like I've seen this happen all the time. There was a time I debated a really, really good team who assumed we were going to read this one card, but we had taken it out of our affirmative, and so we stopped reading it. But the entire debate, they just kept harping on us reading this one card, and they were just like, "You can't read this card. It's really bad for various reasons." We were like, "We didn't read that card. Like, don't know what you're talking about." And they just like kept generalizing that we were either had read the card or that we were going to read the card, and like so we won the debate because the judge just afterwards is like, you didn't read the card. I don't think there's a link to this argument. Right, so writing your strategies around something that doesn't actually happen in the debate might be a hasty generalization. Stereotypes are definitely examples of hasty generalizations, or how like discrimination happens in the real world. And the point of me talking about hasty generalizations, introducing this idea to you all, is not to suggest like don't plan strategies in pre-round, like you obviously should, but it is to suggest that once you have that strategy, you can't just stop and say, this is it, this is what we're going to do for the entire time, no matter what happens, because things change in debate sometimes, right? People make different arguments, or they make arguments using different language, and so that they can talk about it differently and then explain it in different ways later on in the debate. Or they say things that sound really similar to things they've said before, but are not actually the exact same thing they've said before. And so, you know, it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of generalizing what the other team is saying without realizing that it's not what they're saying. So again, kind of like I said, alluded to before, is like flow, pay attention, listen to what other people are saying, and then you should be able to avoid this one. Okay. So that is everything that I have for the lecture. It was kind of, I don't know, kind of a lot, but more like a lot of big, complicated terms. So happy to answer questions as they should pop up now. So one of these questions is, can you call a team out for one of these, or is that the job of the judge? So you should be the one who calls a team out. It's hard to say. So the way I kind of think about it is like this, is that older judges, or judges that have a bit more experience, are more willing to look at another team and basically say, you know, even though this thing was dropped, I don't really know what it means, or I don't really think it makes very much sense, so I'm not going to vote on it. So generally speaking, with judges who have more experience with judging, it is easier to get away with expecting your judge to say, to basically say, no, this was a logical fallacy. With younger judges who are more oriented around, well, this thing was dropped, therefore it must be true, it's not as easy to say that. That, by the way, is me totally overgeneralizing. This is not true of every single judge who has more experience, or every single judge who has less experience, or anything like that. So that probably was a case of generalization that I just said. But if you're in a position where you're just like, basically what I'm saying is, if you're in a position where you recognize another team making a logical fallacy, I think it is a good idea to point out that what they have said is an incomplete argument for some reason or other. You likely don't want to use the language of logical fallacy because a lot of judges are not trained a lot of judges aren't familiar with this language. Like this language that I'm talking to you about now of logical fallacies, ad hominems, ad verecundium, slippery slope, straw person, hasty generalization is argumentation theory proper. So like academic argumentation kinds of things. It's not the terminology that people use in debate. And so it's probably better to explain what you're saying as opposed to just standing up and saying, you know, they said this, but that's ad verecundium, reject it. Like your judge is going to look at you and be like, I don't know what that means, right? Versus if you stand up and say, they said this, that is just an appeal to authority without any explanation of why we should trust that person. So you should be skeptical of it. Instead, you should prefer our argument because blah, 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 blah. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to say, you should be the one who calls these out. Sometimes you can expect your judge to be the one who does it, but you should not always assume that your judge is going to. That's part of ballot writing, really. And you should probably not use this language. You should explain it instead of using the word, the moniker to say what the argument is. All right, what other questions we got? And it can obviously be about anything probably from the lecture. There are no other questions whatsoever. Jeez, I'm a great lecturer if everyone gets this so well. Yeah, Caitlin.
So when you said that sometimes judges like that are younger will say like, because they dropped this argument, then it must be true. Would that be like an example of tech over truth?
I think that often, so I really, really hate the term tech versus truth, like tech over truth or truth over tech, because it's like, in reality, you can't ever actually separate those things. But yes, when someone says they are tech over truth, likely what that means is that they will look at something that's said and say, oh, well, it's dropped, therefore it must be true, even if it's not actually completely explained. That's not always true, because people have different understandings of what tech means and different understandings of what truth means, which again comes back to that phrasing is terrible, and I really wish people would stop saying it because it makes no sense whatsoever. But basically, for the most part, yes.
Okay.
When preparing strategies, how do you recommend making strategies that can be adaptable to changes during the round? It really depends. It's hard to generalize. Basically what the point of that part of this lecture was is that you just need to be ready to think on your feet. You need to be ready to adapt your arguments to things that are based on what's occurring in the debate as well. So, you know, we'd have to have an entirely separate conversation that's like, here's how you do this with this particular counter plan or this particular dissent, this particular critique. And it always also has to be like against this particular team based on what we think they're going to say, or if we think they're going to say things this way, and just, yeah. Theory arguments before a K depends on the judge and the argument. Let's try and keep questions about this lecture if we can. But yeah, that depends on the judge and what the arguments are. Okay. If you don't have any more questions, you think that you're good with everything that's happened, you are welcome to leave. I will hang out here if you would rather talk one-on-one or anything like that. Otherwise, I believe lab starts again at 2 o'clock today, and enjoy your lunch break and everything.